So welcome everybody to the fourth Jean Monnet webinar, Quo Vadis EU, the EU abroad in the world. I hope you can all hear me. Just a warm welcome to all of you, and I would like to give you a few technical details about how this webinar is going to proceed. So if you would like to speak at the end of the presentations, please raise your hand. You will see your name here just underneath the screen where you see me at the moment. And if you click on that name, that means that you show your intention to speak. And after you're given the floor by one of the moderators, then please press the talk button and the video button. It's just also underneath the screen that you just see. That way we have everything in a bit of a more organized manner. And the other thing that I would like just to say is please refrain from drawing on the presentation. We've had this in the past, so please do not change anything there. And otherwise, enjoy the presentations. And now I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Amelia Hadfield. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina, for giving the necessary technical introduction. This is the fourth and final for this year of the Jean Monnet Quo Vadis EU Abroad in the World webinar series. I'm delighted that so many of you can join. I know quite a lot of others are going to be coming on as well. So I'm now going to pass the floor over to Alexander for the first of the 5 sessions and the 3 speakers. Alexander.
Thank you, Amelia, and good morning to all. We are going to tackle in the coming 10 minutes the topic of the EU's role on the global stage, and with that we're actually going to give a very brief introduction to the sort of deeper theme of European strategic culture. So as good professors should do, we shall start with the conceptual basics. Before we can talk sensibly about strategic culture, it is advisable to, of course, start with the concept of strategy itself. Now, as many of you who attended the lecture may recall, the sort of most basic definition of strategy comes actually from the person that we can call the European godfather of strategy, Karl von Clausewitz, the famous military theorist. Strategy, after all, derives from the ancient Greek word strategos, the general, the commander. And strategy, in the Clausewitzian definition, is the use of the engagements, i.e. the use of battles, for the purpose of the war. So it's essentially how to direct military power to achieve political ends. Now, that is obviously a very military-focused definition, and many people since the days of Clausewitz have argued that, well, actually there are different types of power, and you can try to harness the different sorts of power also in a strategic sense. And the new notion of strategy that has emerged out of those debates is that, well, you can have military strategy and you have something that we can call grand strategy, in which everything is about the calculated relationship of means, different sources of power to political ends. And it is that second definition that is probably of most of use here. If we turn our attention to the concept of strategic culture itself, well, it's actually pretty straightforward. It is about the question, how do political actors, political entities, go about exercising, wielding their power, whatever the source of it may be it military, be it economic, be it cultural. And strategic culture, most authors would actually argue, is something that is always very much shaped by the history of that particular actor and the geography, the environment it finds itself in. Obviously, if the political actor is an island, such as the United Kingdom, it obviously makes sense that its strategic culture, its strategic orientation will be more maritime than another political actor on the European continent, such as Germany. It's not just geography in a very narrow sense. I can also say, well, it's a broader political environment that the actor finds himself in, and there you can actually think back to Samuel Johnson's famous saying, "If a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully." That actually suggests that strategy, in many ways, is only a type of behavior that emerges in times of crisis. When everything goes well, many states, many political organizations are not always behaving in a hyper-synchronized fashion, but if the chickens come to roost and the challenges are there, it sort of forces them to become more explicit about how they're actually going to go about calculating the relationship between their means that are available and the different political ends they want to achieve. Now, if we try and apply this theoretical concept of strategic culture to the European Union, a couple of things would seem to suggest themselves naturally. The European Union was de facto historical construction that was built during the second half of the 20th century, which means that it is probably heavily influenced by this Cold War experience and the post-Cold War environment that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The idea of European Union strategic culture also assumes that there is actually a convergence taking place between the foreign policies pursued by the different member states, and as a result, opinions amongst academics and think tankers and pundits are more or less divided over the very question, is there such a thing as an EU strategic culture? Some people will say, the European Union is not in itself a genuinely fully fledged political actor, and it's more of a platform through which member states pursue their foreign policy. So we'll come back to it towards the end of the presentation. But let's go on to the theme of the European Security Strategy, a 2003 document that embodies European strategic culture as no other, to the extent that a strategy or a strategic culture has a material existence rather than an ideational existence. You can find it in documents precisely such as the European Security Strategy. Now, we've covered this in class, so I'm not going to dwell too long upon this, but the very basic summary is that the European Security Strategy sort of provided an overview of the security environment in the aftermath of the Cold War. It identified 5 main threats, which are listed on the slide. It also formulated the key strategic objectives, the most important of which are, well, let's try and keep our neighborhood secure, and as far as the broader, the wider world is concerned, let's try and develop a rule-based international order based on effective multilateralism. And then also a couple of policy implications were formulated on that basis. We'll jump to those policy implications in a short while. In the years that passed since the European Security Strategy was adopted, there were a couple of major policy debates over whether it should be revisited, whether other issues should be added to the EU's strategic agenda. Themes such as cybersecurity, energy security, climate change very much became part of the news cycle, and as a result also entered onto the political radar screen of policymakers in Brussels. And in 2008, there was then a report on the implementation of the European Security Strategy that essentially took stock of a couple of these new agenda points that could be added. The main thrust of the recommendations that was put forward in 2008 was that, well, more capabilities would be needed, more regional engagement was desirable, and the EU should try and develop more partnerships with other actors on the world stage. Now, if you go and read Karl von Clausewitz, his big book on strategy, actually on war, he says, well, strategy, it's sort of very easy in theory, but it's always very difficult in practice. And you can actually say the same thing about the European security strategy, in the sense that, well, as far as actual operations and crisis management missions are concerned, those that took place under the banner of the common security and defense policy, which my colleague Lewis will talk about in more detail. You can actually wonder, well, to what extent were all those operations genuinely strategic in the effects that they created, and to what extent were they part of a bigger political agenda that had a conscious intent of shaping the international environment the European Union would find itself in. There are a lot of debates to be had over this, and the sort of main conclusions that academics have drawn on the basis of such debates is, well, the common security and defense policy de facto provided a sort of policy laboratory to experiment with new types and ways of going about crisis management operations. But as far as the outcomes are concerned, well, most people would agree that these are not necessarily negligible, but in any case relatively modest. And a good part of the academic literature has actually been devoted to the theme that cooperation in practice, in bureaucratic terms, is actually something that is very desirable from the position of a bystander and a disinterested observer, but something that is very, very difficult to implement when you're actually part of these big bureaucratic structures. So we have a lot of turf wars between the Commission and Council Secretariat, mistrust between civilian staff and military staff, mistrust and lack of synchronization between different international organizations such as the European Union, the United Nations, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, what are the main obstacles that the critics would identify when it comes to EU strategic culture and EU strategy as such? Well, the skeptics would say, well, all the different member states that together constitute the European Union, they all have their own history and they all have their own geographical position on the continent, which informs the policy preferences that they put forward and that they defend at the bargaining table in Brussels. That is obviously something that is materially out there and that is very hard to disagree with. But I think the best counter argument that can be made was the version that I picked up at a conference. It was voiced by a German MEP. He said, "Well, I'm from Hamburg, and I still don't like the guys from Bavaria, but we're all Germans, and why can't we do the same thing on a European level?" And that is, I think, the strongest counter argument to the skepticism about all European nations with different histories. How can they possibly work together? Well, because at the end of the day, they're all European and they're all in one part of the world, and the rest of the world is increasingly dominated by continental-sized powers, United States, China, India, and if we want to play ball with these guys, we just have to do it together. The second major obstacle that one can mention is that, well, going about exercising power on the international stage effectively is a very, very expensive business. Whether it is military power or economic power, there's always a price tag attached to it. and it is all too easy to say in many press declarations, we want to do this and we want to achieve that, but it always requires an investment that member states and their electorates are not always willing to make. And the current debate that we see over the future of the eurozone make this clear, to a sufficient level, I guess. The third major obstacle, and here we're delving a bit deeper into institutional questions, is, well, how do you actually achieve the sort of coherence that strategic behavior would seem to imply? Well, as far as the construction of the European Union is concerned, the attempt that was embodied in the Lisbon Treaty was precisely to increase this coherence, to take a quantum leap forward, to give a single phone number and a single voice to the European Union's foreign policy. But one can actually argue that so far the actual implementation of the Lisbon Treaty shows that the European Union up to now is not really living up to the expectations that were generated many years ago when these proposals were first formulated. And then the sort of logical conclusion for that is, well, to what extent is the current common foreign and security policy as conceived under the Lisbon Treaty, is it really endowing the European Union with a single voice, endowing the structure in Brussels to go and conduct foreign policy on behalf of the member states, or is it a sort of vehicle, an organizational platform through which member states can try and mitigate their decreasing international relevance as nation states that are increasingly small states compared to many of the other world actors. Okay, let's wrap up. I think the European Union, in developing its strategic culture to the extent that there is one, and I think there is one, but it's not of the same nature as the strategic culture that nation states have, has brought about a lot of conceptual innovation. I think as far as crisis management is concerned, there has been a really interesting experiment in terms of synchronizing the civilian toolkit and the military toolkit. Having said that, this is also a bit of a glass that is half full or half empty story, in the sense that, well, yes, there has been a lot of positive experimenting, but in order to really deliver on the promise that such experimenting generates, well, we would sort of expect to take it to the next level. And in that sense, the major breakthrough would only come about when the sort of comprehensive approach that many people in Brussels would constantly refer to would not just be a set of empty words in diplomatic speeches, but something that you can really observe in the field, which is not always the case. I think I'll end it here and hand over to my colleague Louis Simon. Louis, over to you.
Thanks, Alexander, and hello to all, and welcome. I hope you enjoyed Alexander's presentation on the EU and strategic culture as much as I did. Now, what I'm going to do in some 10 to 15 minutes is to try and summarize. Wait, hang on, let me put the slide. Is to try and summarize the main points I made in the two lectures I gave recently. One on CSDP and the other one on EUUS Relations. I'll start with the first one. So I'm going to run you through the history and the different aspects of the common security and defense policy in some 5 to 7 minutes. As I mentioned back in the lecture, The CSDP is part of the Common Foreign and Security Policy, and that means that it's subordinated to it. And so in order to understand the origins and development of the Common Security and Defense Policy, we need to understand first the evolution of European cooperation in foreign and security policy more broadly. So let's do that very briefly before I turn into CSDP proper. All right. So Europeans engaged in a number of European-only foreign security and defense policy cooperation ventures during the Cold War, meaning outside of NATO and the transatlantic framework. I want to outline three examples which are particularly important, I think, in this regard, which are the Western European Union, which was an institution that framed defense cooperation among Western European countries and was created in 1947 and managed to survive up until 2011 when it was officially disbanded. The WEU, in spite of the fact that it survived the entire Cold War period, it never quite managed to get rid of its image as a talking shop. So it succeeded in surviving, but it didn't quite succeed politically. It was in NATO where most European countries coordinated their defense policies. A second example of European cooperation in defense matters during the Cold War, also a failure, although a complete failure in this case, was the European Defense Community, which was a project tabled by the French in 1950 and rejected also by the French National Assembly in 1954. And then I want to mention a third project, which was the most successful, I would say, but it was restricted to cooperation in foreign policy, and it explicitly excluded any elements that had military implications, and it was called European Political Cooperation. This was a scheme adopted in 1970, aimed at strengthening foreign policy cooperation among the members of the then European Community. European political cooperation existed between 1970 and 1992, when it was effectively replaced by the Common Foreign and Security Policy, which I will be talking about right away. All right. So with the end of the Cold War, the process of European integration took a qualitative leap, as most of you I'm sure know, with the adoption of monetary union, but so did too a European cooperation in foreign and security policy with the creation of CFSP at Maastricht in 1992. Now, the two main changes brought about by the Common Foreign and Security Policy in relation to European political cooperation were the promise to bring about a common defense, which is a subject that, as I was saying before, European political cooperation explicitly ruled out, and the sort of formalization of European foreign and security policy cooperation with the introduction of two legal or semi-legal, dare I say, figures called joint actions and common positions, whose task would be to sort of implement the common foreign and security policy. In contrast to the common foreign and security policy, European political cooperation was a much more informal and loose political arrangement, and CFSP has sort of like a legalistic ambition. All right, so that was at Maastricht. The main two things about the CFSP was the declaration, the commitment to bring about eventually a common defense policy for the European Union, and the sort of legalization or formalization of foreign and security policy cooperation with the adoption of two legal figures, joint actions and common positions. Now, 5 years after that, the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty brought about three main changes in the area of CFSP: the introduction of yet another political legal figure, which was the common strategy, and that would frame the context in which joint actions and common positions would develop, and then the creation of the position of a high representative for the common foreign and security policy, which would be representing Europe abroad, the European Union abroad, and the establishment of a new mechanism aimed at facilitating decision-making in the area of CFSP, which was called constructive abstention, which would allow some member state to proceed which would allow some member states to abstain from explicitly approving a particular foreign policy decision without impeding the others to proceed forward. Okay, so those are the three main novelties brought about by the Amsterdam Treaty in the area of CFSP. Now, 2 years after Amsterdam, at the 1999 Cologne European Council, the European Union finally, or the European Council finally, took up its promise of adopting a common security policy. It was a common security policy, not a common defense policy, as promised in Maastricht, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. I don't want to get into the specifics of that debate, as important as it is. So at Cologne, the European Council committed, as I was saying, to a critical expansion of the common foreign and security policy by declaring that the European Union, and I'm quoting from the Cologne European Council Declaration, should have the capability for autonomous action backed up by the credible military forces, the means to decide to use them, and a readiness to do so in order to respond to international crises. Now, the so-called Petersburg tasks provide a reference for the kind of tasks that the newly created common security and defense policy would concentrate on, and these are listed in the next slide. The Petersburg tasks include humanitarian and rescue tasks, peacekeeping tasks, and tasks of combat forces in crisis management, including peacemaking. All right. Now, if the 1999 Cologne European Council provides CSDP with a vision that would turn around a Petersburg-style crisis management, 6 months later, the December 1999 Helsinki European Council translated this sort of political vision into operational language with the adoption of the 2003 headline goal. According to the 2003 headline goal, Europeans should be able to deploy rapidly and then sustain forces capable of the full range of Petersburg tasks as set out in the Amsterdam Treaty, including the most demanding in operations up to corps level, meaning up to 15 brigade or 50 to 60,000 soldiers. So this is the sort of translation of the political objectives of the Cologne European Council into actual operational language. What does that mean in terms of capabilities? Now, once 6 months after that, after the December 1999, Helsinki European Council, the European Council got together again in Santa Maria da Feira in Portugal in June of 2000 to agree on a civilian headline goal, which was when civilian CSDP, the civilian arm of CSDP, was born. The 2003 civilian headline goal aimed at the deployment of 5,000 police officers for missions across the range of conflict prevention and crisis management by 2003. So we have the Cologne European Council sort of stating the political objectives of the CSDP along Petersburg-style crisis management. Then we have the 2003 military headline goal translating those objectives into operational language, and we have then the 2003 civilian headline goal delivering the sort of civilian arm of those objectives. Now, once the operational objectives of CSDP had been set by the military and civilian headline goals, the December 2000 European Council at Nice established the relevant permanent political and military structures that would provide the institutional basis of CSDP. This include, and I'm gonna quote I'm gonna name the main ones: the Political and Security Committee, which is the highest decision-making body of the Common Security and Defense Policy, the European Union Military Committee, the European Union Military Staff, or the Civilian Planning and Conduct Capability. And if you want, we can talk about the specifics and the roles of those respective institutions later on. Now, after the operational and institutional foundations of CSDP have been laid out in the early years, in a very short time span, as you can see, between 1999 and 2001, The second biggest push in the development of the common security and defense policy came in late 2003 in the context of the broader negotiations over the 2004 Constitutional Treaty, which was renamed, as you all know, as the Lisbon Treaty in 2007, and also in the context of the Iraq War. Okay. Now, of the I'm not going to get into specifics, but of the several additions that occurred in CSDP between late 2003 and early 2004, four are particularly important. The creation of the European Defence Agency, the launch of CSDP's first civilian operation in January 2003 in Bosnia, and the first military operation in the former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia, and the creation of the European Union battle groups in early 2004. Finally, I want to tell you about the main changes brought about by the Lisbon Treaty in the area of CSDP. As you all probably know, the 2007 Lisbon Treaty brings about very important changes in the area of the common foreign and security policy, including the creation of a European External Action Service, or the upgrading of the position of High Representative for the common foreign and security policy, which has been merged with the position of Commissioner for External Relations. But the Lisbon Treaty contains actually very few novelties in the area of CSDP proper. And the main ones are the expansion of the Petersburg tasks to include the post-conflict stabilization and the fight against terrorism, and the introduction of a new political legal mechanism to facilitate European political development, which is called Permanent Structured Cooperation, which we talked about in the lecture. But Permanent Structured Cooperation, however, as many of you probably know, has failed in the last couple of years due to political disagreements, and has been replaced by a much looser format, by a much looser arrangement for capability development called pooling and sharing. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that and move now quickly to the second topic of EU-US relations. I realize that this is all very, very fast, but what are we going to do? Okay, so let me give you now a couple of pointers on the subject of EU-US relations. Now, instead of giving you a descriptive presentation about the sorry, this is not the right slide. Now, instead of giving you a descriptive presentation about the institutional relationship between the European Union and the United States and its different aspects, I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to address this topic from a much broader perspective. I'm going to talk to you about how the U.S. factor has affected the process of European integration and the evolution of European politics, European geopolitics more broadly. Okay, very quickly, in some 6-7 minutes. So, as you all know, the United States had a pivotal position in post-war European politics, and as such, it unavoidably played a critical role in the birth of European integration. As the Cold War was emerging in the late 1940s, the United States, but also the United Kingdom, although it had much less power, much less political power than the United States, but the United States believed that the unification of West Germany, its reindustrialization, and its remilitarization were crucial if the Western effort to contain the Soviet Union was to be successful in Central Europe. The Americans and the British thought that Germany's industrial wherewithal and manpower were crucial to contain the Soviet Union conventionally, because otherwise the Western effort would have required a lot of American money and troops and British money and troops. But for a number of reasons, the French opposed to the remilitarization and reindustrialization of West Germany that could not actually resist the process, because the Americans and the British were calling the shots at the time. So it was in a context of in an environment in which France's choices were constrained and imposed by the strategic decisions made by the U.S. and the UK. It was in this context that the French came up with the 1949 Schuman Plan, which, as you all know, is the embryo of the European integration process. For the French, the Schuman Plan was a pragmatic and effective solution to their concerns about German power, about the effects that reindustrialization and remilitarization could have upon German power. That was what the Schuman Plan was mostly about. We have to remember that the Schuman Plan originated in Paris, and this is what the Schuman Plan was mostly about. And then under the European Coal and Steel Community, West Germany would surrender control over the industries of the Ruhr Valley that had allowed Germany to outperform and overrun France in the past, and it would surrender control over such industries to a supranational authority. So it was sort of a way. The Schuman Plan was a way to mitigate the U.S. decision, the U.S.-British decision, to allow Germany to reindustrialize and to remilitarize. Right? So if European integration was sort of the first caveat to Germany's remilitarization, West Germany's integration within NATO's military structure was the second caveat. So if you know, Germany's reindustrialization and remilitarization was mitigated by the role of the European community on the one hand, that allowed a supranational authority to exercise control over Germany's industrial resources, and on the other hand, by Germany's military integration within NATO's structure. Okay, as I'm sure most of you know, throughout the entire Cold War period, West Germany lacked an independent command and control infrastructure. The German armed forces were completely under U.S. command via NATO. So this is the context in which the European integration this is the geopolitical context in which the European integration process came about. Okay, so if you want, NATO and the European Community were two different instruments at the service of the same geopolitical objectives: to keep the Germans down, and secondly, and progressively, I would say more and more important, to keep the Russians out of Europe. As you know, the security of Western Europe against the Soviet Union depended not only upon territorial defense, but also upon the political stability and economic development. Okay, so if you want, then the NATO and the EC were part of the same package. The assumption of the interdependence among the military, political, and socioeconomic aspects of security was central to post-war American strategy, American-European strategy. So the United States and American geostrategic objectives sort of provided the framework in which the European integration process took hold. This sort of template remained throughout most of the Cold War, where, as you know, NATO would and the transatlantic relationship would frame the policies of European countries in the area of high politics, security, defense, high strategy, whereas the European community would deal with the so-called low politics, economics, and social aspects. Now, but this sort of division of labor was challenged by the collapse of the Cold War order that has sort of framed that institutional arrangement. Now, as I'm sure you all know by now, the collapse of the Soviet Union led many IR scholars and pundits to assume a rapid shift of U.S. geostrategic priorities away from the European continent and towards other areas of the world. And it's true that there were significant troop reductions, which led to a reduction from some 290,000 U.S. military personnel in Europe in 1990 to less than 80,000 in 2010. But having said that, I think the post-Cold War period, and particularly the 1990s, was actually characterized by important geostrategic continuities that kept the United States very much tied to developments on the European continent. I think throughout the 1990s, the United States and NATO continued to play a pivotal position in the European international system, and I think this is very much illustrated by the fact that the U.S. played a decisive role in the most significant developments in post-Cold War Europe, including the process of German reunification, without which we cannot explain the development of European Monetary Union, including the enlargement of NATO and by association the European Union to Central and Eastern Europe, and including the pacification of the Western Balkans. These three developments, German reunification, Eastern enlargement of both the EU and NATO, and the stabilization of the Western Balkans, were all directed politically from Washington. And these three developments have largely determined the existence and the direction of the European Union throughout most of the 1990s and part of the 2000s. So at a broader level, at a more systemic level, the decisions made in the United States were radically determining the agenda of the European Union regarding both economic and monetary union, and also the common foreign and security policy, which, as you know, in the early years was almost exclusively devoted to the Western Balkans. But now this sort of situation, this sort of equilibrium has been changing, I think, in the last decade. From the early 2000s, and largely, I would say, animated by the events of September the 11th, the United States started to pull its military, political, and strategic attention away from Europe and towards the east, to Afghanistan and Iraq first, and now, or later on, to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And the United States started to do this from the early 2000s, precisely at the very time when the sort of order that the United States had created during the Cold War in the European continent was actually expanding onto Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, and not only other parts of Europe, but also the Southern Mediterranean and the Levant. So it's very interesting that the combination of a more stable Central and Eastern European environment and the weakening of America's presence in the continent actually multiplied substantially Germany's possibilities and strategic freedom of maneuver. And this, I think, this is my own view, represented a qualitative change in the mechanics of the European integration process, which until then had been sustained by a Franco-German engine where German strategic dependence on the West, which was given by its vulnerability in its eastern border, translated into French political and strategic leadership of the European Union. So I think America's sort of diversion of strategic attention away from Europe from the early 2000s affected the political balance within the European Union. But not only that, it also gave Russia and Turkey breathing space in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, which were environments that had until then also been largely defined around the America's strong military and political commitment. And I think this has been getting worse in the last few years, particularly since the financial crisis, because we're seeing U.S. financial, political, and we're seeing a financial, political, and military fatigue in the United States, and the strategic rise of China and of Asia, which are further compounding America's geostrategic shift towards Asia. And this is, I believe, is naturally affecting the balance of power within Europe and within the broader European neighborhood, because that balance of power had been defined, and the institutional landscape that sort of reflects that balance of power had been both defined by America's military and strategic hegemony. So the interesting question right now, I think, is how is the vacuum left by America's geostrategic shift away from the broader European neighborhood being filled? And of course, just for the record, I mean, the United States is not just leaving entirely. I mean, the United States continues to have important strategic and economic interests in Europe, so it's a relative process I'm talking about. So now, currently, I see four main geostrategic dynamics that are filling a great deal of the vacuum left by the United States geostrategic reorientation away from Europe and its broader neighborhood. And they are the new British-French alliance, a German-French-led project of European economic and political integration of a continental nature. Alexander was talking about strategic culture before. This project has a much more continental nature and ambition, whereas the British-French alliance is much more maritime in its culture and its geostrategic approach, in the sense that it's extra regional in its focus. The third phenomenon, the third geostrategic dynamic would be Russia's resurgence across Europe's east. And the fourth would be Turkey's increasing presence in southeastern Europe, in the Balkan Peninsula, in the Caucasus, in the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and parts of northern Africa, particularly northeastern Africa. Now, these four dynamics manifest very differently in the sense that they lean on very different instruments and have different geographical areas of priority. And of course, they're not always clear-cut, and they often overlap with each other, because we're after all in a period of change where pretty much everything in Europe is, I believe, in flux, including the institutions that dominate the European political and discursive landscape. And so, with some of the dynamics can merge, some of them can go in different ways. And that remains to be seen over the next few years, and will also depend on the nature of America's downsizing in the broader European neighborhood. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm not going to get into the specific of each one of these geostrategic dynamics. I think that will give you sort of like a general overview of the lecture that I gave to you a couple of weeks ago. Thank you, Amelia. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Once again, a tremendous tour de force. I like the idea that the webinar enforces compression, certainly for you guys as well as for us. And so there's going to be a true exercise in compression now if I want to try to get through EU-Russia relations and climate change and energy security in 17 minutes. So we'll see what we can do. I think most of you will be able to hark back to the lecture. Most of the EU-Russia relations I talked about focused on energy, so I certainly want to flag that up as well. But it's good to bear in mind, of course, that the modes of engagement or the zones, of course, between Russia and the European Union are threefold. Security, of course, including border control, transit and visas, primarily looking at the difficult role of Kaliningrad, the oblast. Free trade and investment, perhaps maybe the zone that we overlook the most, and of course energy security, gas and oil, with a real look to see how reliable a partner Russia is in this sense. It's good, I think, also to have a chronology of the EU-Russia relations, kick-started, of course, in 1997 with the PCA, languishing even now on the sidelines, but there have been a number of other developments, including a regional strategy like the Northern Dimension, and of course the rather failed common strategy for Russia. Quiet sideline actor, of course, is the EU-Russia Energy Dialogue, begun in 1999-2000, now in its 11th year. As I mentioned in the lecture, this is a place where you do get low-level technical but quite decent moves forward between the two entities in terms of aspects of energy security, and of course as well as the various biannual summits that have taken place in the last 10 years. I noted the one in 2008, the Akanti-Mansiysk Summit, which was designed to replace the existing PCA, but in fact only a sort of very thin blueprint of a comprehensive framework for the two sides came out of it. But I think it was certainly the most substantive step forward that we've seen between those two entities in the last 2 or 3 years. In 2010, there were a dozen negotiating rounds completed, but again on very low-level issues as well. The biggest summit we've seen, of course, was last year, each naming the other as strategic partners, each sending their biggest, their brightest, their best. And in a sense, I think it was a kind of acceptance of Russia's new WTO status, formally accepting it into the World Trade Organization, formally approving it, and in a sense, sort of moving Russia to the next tier with regards to trade status and trade partner. And in a sense, as I suggested, perhaps the European Union having lost something of a bargaining chip here, particularly with energy. They used to use the WTO membership as something that Russia had to strive for and had to attain before beginning to move further forward for the greater engagement of the European Union. But now that bargaining chip has gone, in terms of energy relations, suffice it to say that at this point the European Union is heavily dependent for all its energy, in fact every aspect except for coal, but that's not going to be a going concern until something radical shifts, and perhaps the radical shift is something I'll mention in a couple of minutes. At this point, Russia is a very large supplier of conventional gas, conventional natural gas, primarily through east-west pipelines, but also quite a bit of oil as well, and some coal as well. Although, as I mentioned before, the European Union has a much more healthy profile in terms of its oil imports, its gas imports, I think, are certainly decidedly lopsided and tipped in favor of Russia, first of all, North Africa, and also the Gulf. And I think an interesting step forward is the aligning of the technological reliance and also the political reliance. Only since, I would say, the gas bath of 2006 has the European Union effectively woken up to the foreign policy implications, the security implications of energy itself. Only after the gas bath do you get this avalanche of white papers and policy papers accepting that foreign policy and energy security have something to do with each other. While Russia, I think, has long been au fait with this particular reality and has a very clear ability to wield energy production for its own ends as a measure of its national prowess, and quite possibly as a foreign policy tool for immediate gains in its near neighborhood, but possibly for long-term leverage of many types within and over the European Union. Russia, in terms of an energy actor, as I mentioned, is a triple-hatted actor. It's a producer, it's a great consumer, which is something we tend to forget, and it has an energy inefficiency problem here. And of course, it's a transit country. You have to bear in mind that all of the Caspian states, effectively sitting beneath Russia, allow it to be a transit country for the oil and particularly the gas that comes from that region across Russia and into the European Union as well. We do continue to see state control over gas, oil, and pipeline sectors, and as you'll see in these lovely slides now, a variety of east-west cobwebs of oil pipelines drawn from some major oil fields and some major gas fields. There you go. You can look at these in your leisure. That's what I like to do. And then you can see the penetration of the Russian oil and gas pipeline projects, moving again comprehensively from east to west. And the strongest, most recent link, of course, was Nord Stream into the north of Germany, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. If you focus in terms of the intensity of gas transfer, you're looking at Ukraine and Belarus. 80% of the European Union's gas comes through the two major pipelines, the Brotherhood and the Soyuz. So this is very much a choke point, if you like. It's a linchpin. It's a strategic point, and another 20% through the Northern Light pipelines in Belarus, as you can quite clearly see from this point. I think, in a sense, it's difficult to talk about the European Union as a unified energy actor for a number of reasons, not least of which different countries use different forms, types, and ratios of energy, depending on their geological and geographical location, but also in terms of their political affiliation and orientation towards or against Russia. So in very blunt terms, there are pro-Gazprom attitudes and anti-Gazprom attitudes. Pro-Gazprom attitudes certainly with regards to regarding Gazprom and Russia as a reliable actor in Germany, France, Italy, and Austria. Bilateral contracts signed repeatedly with Gazprom here, pipelines undertaken, gas storage facilities undertaken as well. Whereas in areas of Eastern Europe, and particularly in Poland, there's a profound disquiet with regards to reliance on Gazprom and political negotiations with Russia in general, and also in areas like the Ukraine, of course, the most troublesome of the transit states. Here we see anxiety and opposition to the growing clout, if I can put it this way, from Russia, and the potential to embrace or even surround the European Union via a network of pipelines. At this point, of course, we're still regarding the member states' ability as a very solid ability to negotiate bilateral contracts, its own agreements, despite the new solidarity clause, Article 122 in Lisbon, recommending, encouraging the member states to kind of bind together in terms of seeking out new energy security partners. And some of these clashes have spilled out into the open. So we do have a very unhappy or rather discordant view of energy needs in terms of suppliers. I'll come on to this point again in a minute. In terms of pipeline politics, I think there's a threefold story. You probably already know certainly about the Nord Stream link, opened just a few months ago between Russia and northern Germany, an exclusive bilateral pipeline consortium there. But in terms of South Stream and Nabucco, I think what's interesting to be able to see here is the wider spread of shareholders. In terms of the Nabucco pipeline, as you can see, you're looking at 6 major actors, each with about a 16% share, a rather equal share, Bulgarian Energy Holdings and BOTAS, FGSZ, OMV, RWE, and Transgas. This has a very stop-start history, very unhappy history of negotiations failing and then restarting, contracts being signed and then stalled again. And the same, I have to be said, for South Stream. South Stream, again, another Russian initiative, but bringing on European partners as well, European energy partners. You're looking at 4 major partners here, each with a different version. Gazprom, of course, with a majority shareholding of 50 or even 51%, and then ENI with 20, Wintershall Holding and EDF 15% each. So you can see the sort of partnership and the identities that work there, but each of them are very deeply political, as you can imagine. There is, I think, a sense, even despite the moves of Lisbon to bring energy and energy security far more within the competence of the Union, I think it disquiets that it's incomplete at this point. The story is an incomplete one. Some areas the Commission has a much greater holdover, and other areas we see the Member States continuing to be very vocal, very vociferous, on political terms as well as technological ones, about what type of energy is best for them and with whom they'd like to fight to get it. The third internal market, of course, is a very contentious one. The idea, of course, to throw open, finally complete the market of the European Union in terms of gas and electricity, and also to do it in a way which makes monopolies inside and outside the Union something of a thing of the past by using the tool called unbundling. One quick point before I finish on this section is the rather shocking, although this is underplayed, I think, in many areas, termination by Russia of its provisional application of the Energy Charter Treaty. I spent some time in the lecture going over the role of the Energy Charter Treaty, signed and put together really in the last 20 years or so to allow collaboration, integration and cooperation between Eastern and Western European energy actors. And I think it's been a tremendous but rather quiet success. Unfortunately, the one actor that it was supposed to be able to work with in strident and robust terms, of course, being Russia, much like the European neighbourhood policy, Russia simply didn't accept or believe or take on the European rationale behind the treaty, always unhappy with the scope and the numerous obligations imposed upon it, at least in its view, by the Energy Charter Treaty, and to the point where Russia now seems very visibly to have come afoul of the ECT, and has been found liable under the ECT, despite only applying it provisionally, for breaches of investors' rights, the majority of which are arising from the bankrupting of the EUUS oil company. These were decided by the panel to amount to measures equivalent to expropriation. So it's, in an odd way, it's shown just how powerful the treaty is, but also in a sense that Russian withdrawal continues to make it a very interesting, a very potent mix of East-West energy relations and the sloughing off of relations. Is Russian withdrawal of its provisional application the nail in the coffin? No, of course not. It continues to be a signatory. The treaty continues on to apply, and in fact the investor obligations continue to apply to Russia for the next 20 years, in fact. So it has in no way managed to get out from under the gravity of the treaty, if you like. Just the final point here, now moving back, if I can put it to sort of Putin 2.0 in terms of the Russian era, we've seen, I think, quite a lot of similarities and dissimilarities between Putin and Medvedev. Medvedev was understood to be something of a liberal, trying quietly from the inside to make reforms within Russia. Now we have the return of Putin. It's interesting that there's something of a split, perhaps, in the grasp of his power, both on the inside and on the outside. But between these two men, I think there's a dedication to make Russia a strong and modern country. They're going to, of course, have to put their money where their mouth is in terms of transforming the place into a decent investment climate. That means being far more friendly to Western and Asian energy actors in terms of inviting them in and keeping them in. Russia has something of a habit of inviting investors in and then throwing them out, which makes it difficult to maintain a steady investment climate. There is something of a division of labor labor between the two. We might see in the future Putin's priority to continue to make Russia strong, but if this means chopping the budget, it will be Medvedev who has the unhappy project, the unhappy goal of having to do that. Right, let's finish off then with some of the interesting points I hope that I covered last Friday, and that's the security implications of climate change. Which I think if we'd done this sort of lecture even 5 or 6 years ago, this probably would not have features. But given the tremendous upsurge in interest in terms of climate change and the EU's burgeoning leadership role, it's interesting, I think, to chart the picture here of who is who. Clearly, we're going to focus on the European Union, but there are a variety of very significant actors, most notably the United Nations and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as some very leading governments, particularly within the European Union, Germany and the UK, possibly also Sweden as well, and a variety of national reports which have come out of very much focused attention on climate change, the medium to versus the long-term cost of addressing it or not addressing it, and the type of geological and temperate fallout that we're going to see if we don't address it. One of the readings I suggested, this is in fact comes from my colleague Alexander here, was a Podesta and Ogden article. I like this because it's a nice balance, I think, between the slightly apocalyptic world with regards to food and water shortages and natural disasters, but a sort of pragmatic suggestion to understand it in terms of science, telling only part of the story, in that geopolitical consequences of change are in fact man-made. They're local, they're political, they're social, and the economic facts, as much as the magnitude of climate shift itself. So there's this rather difficult balance to strike between unpredictable and untouchable climatic shifts in the natural world and the human world with the geopolitical consequences as to what happens after those climate changes take place or whilst it's happening. And also a couple of interesting points about where some forms of climate change might actually be good, including rainfall for desert regions, etc., etc. There's a variety of different types of damage, which I mentioned, and folks like the European Union and the UN categorize these threats of damage as threat multipliers, things which exacerbate threats in areas which are already very unresistant, very vulnerable. Here we would find least developed states, particularly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, poverty-struck states, states with failing institutions, underfunded capacity. These are the states which are going to suffer the most, not only because of the unfortunate political structure, but because they happen to be geologically in the wrong area of the world. So in terms of the United Nations General Assembly, the 5 threat multipliers that they identified were vulnerability and development, coping insecurity, statelessness, and international conflict as well. In terms of the first couple, again, what you're getting is this kind of unhappy overlap between already vulnerable areas which see a lack of food security or poor human health, which suggests an increased human exposure to extreme events. So the development work already being done by the EU and the UN is in fact going to be either stopped, slowed, or reversed. So as we see worsening vulnerability, particular projects, development-focused projects, perhaps like food security or tackling water scarcity, are going to find it a very big ask in the next 10 or 20 years to actually get the job done, because they have not only just the man-made difficulties to struggle against, but the climatic shifts to struggle against as well. Statelessness is an interesting point. As I mentioned before, states themselves can be literally disappeared via desertification. They can be taken over by migration of groups who feel moving from an area of vulnerability and scarcity to an area that seems to be more rich and more fertile, or through sheer state collapse. So there are different types of statelessness and very different implications for the rights of those moving into and currently within a particular state. And of course, the greatest threat of all is that you get a knock-on effect not just between borders, boundaries, and regions, but between states themselves, generated by climate change. Threat minimizers, things that are going to help lower the risk, are of course the tools that you and I are most familiar with, i.e. climate mitigation and adaptation, tackling it through broad institutional connections of governance, international cooperation. I think in terms of the European Union and the UN, we've seen some good steps towards this, perhaps not very fast ones. And most interestingly of all, better data, better information, more accurate data. as well as a more critical understanding of the link between climate change and threat conditions. I'm speaking, to you now as if that link is already assumed, that it's causal, but that link is not only, in some senses, a coincidental one or a correlatory one. Where it is causal, it's not well enough understood yet. So we need to kind of chart that and be a little more specific about it. What has the European Union done in terms of solutions? I think more simply, it's just made itself a fairly visible and credible actor, starting from the Rio days of 1992, naming climate change in its European security strategy from 2003 onwards, to taking it seriously, not just sort of annexing it or appendixing it. Perhaps learning from its failures, if I can be delicate about it, the Copenhagen negotiating failure certainly was, I think, a wake-up call to the European Union to assume it didn't always have the answers, nor did it have the right negotiating methodology. Certainly, having been sidelined at those negotiations, I think really struck a chord. More recently, the success it appears to have encountered in Durban, as well as the Foreign Affairs Council adopting concrete conclusions on EU climate diplomacy, not only gives us a new term, a new category to work with, but possibly a slightly better track record. The paper that I circulated for this lecture from the High Rep and the Commission, while a little bit outdated now, 2008, I think gives you a clear understanding, much like energy security, that the EU is cognizant and fairly active, at least with regards to acknowledging the risks of climate change as real and continuing, and also beginning to place the European Union as an actor within the possibility of reacting, depending on the type of tools and instruments it would like to draw on. As this statement points out, the comprehensive approach to conflict prevention, for example, may be one of the European Union's particular tools. Crisis management and post-conflict reconstruction, but as I pointed out in the lecture, there's something of a reactive theme here rather than an active theme, and as we're repeatedly told with climate change, we cannot wait. The EU's own view of CC threats are sevenfold. They're broadly overlapping with the UN ones, but perhaps in a sense they're slightly more worked out, or rather better worked out, including conflict over resources, and most interestingly of all, perhaps trying to chart the economic damage. What is climate change going to cost us? Which cities, which states, why? And then there's this focus on mega cities sitting on mega deltas, particularly if they're large economic areas, perhaps like London. The loss of territory, the knock-on effect of border disputes, the impact of desertification, and I've quoted this because I think it's very pertinent, the vicious circle of degradation and then migration that kickstarts territory conflicts, which in turn threatens the political stability of countries and regions. So there's an increasing sense that even small increases in temperature can quite quickly be something of a domino effect in kickstarting political instability of countries and perhaps even whole regions. Environmentally induced migration, I think perhaps of the European Union, looking across the Mediterranean, this is a significant security issue, either from North Africa or from the region underneath North Africa, and that's of course the Sahel. Clear areas of border conflict where you get an amplification of a vulnerable state already, finding the effect of climate change just that much, just the straw that breaks the camel's back and makes migration look like a very good idea. Fragility and radicalization, another interesting theme that we've seen in North Africa and in the Sahel, that in groups who find themselves susceptible or vulnerable in terms of not having income or livelihood, that there are particular groups, for example, like Akim, who perhaps offer something of a temptation to groups on the move, to radicalize or to blame perhaps current governments for their vulnerabilities, or simply as a way out. And also energy security. Naturally, there's a huge strain if particular access or assets go offline, particularly oil and gas or uranium assets. There has already been something of a scramble, but I think the climate change aspects might make that even more profound. And of course, the European Union's own view is that international governance is clear here, but it's not always necessarily well managed. And if it's not rather more methodically put together with regards to who is doing what, so very many indicators of climate change and maxims and minuses as well, but the entire multilateral system itself is at risk if the community doesn't in a strategic and a systematic way fail to address the threats of climate change. Very briefly then, the threefold EU solutions, using itself, what enhanced capabilities, what tools at the EU level exist, intense R&D, intensifying R&D, and linking up actors, so getting the European Union yellow pages, so to speak, and going through them and finding out who should be talking to who. And everything from early warning and citizen right down to migration watchdogs. There's plenty of actors, but there's not a reliable cobweb between them that suggests that the security implications of climate change are A, understood, or B, being clearly and methodically dealt with, including member state planning and capabilities. Secondly, again, green activeness, the European Union's multilateral leadership in the world suggested that there was a fairly decent outcome to the Durban climate, but at the same time, whilst getting everybody on board, they only expect agreement in 2015, which is a while away, and implementation in 2020. And that's quite a while away. And certainly climate change is not going to wait. So there is a question mark as to how effective that good agreement is, however laudable it may be. And finally, most interestingly, the impact of foreign policy, which European Union regional strategies, which foreign policy tools can be brought together with climate change, with security, with the climate change impacts into something of a holistic package. So again, this means recognizing explicitly the causal link and the different types of causal links between climate change, political insecurity, migratory insecurity, societal and economic insecurity, and looking very clearly at what the EU has on offer in terms of, for example, its neighborhood policy, its EU-Africa strategy, its Central Asia strategy, and figuring out where the gaps are, what still needs to be addressed, what needs to be tightened up in terms of a clear identification of a threat and a decent strategy with regards to addressing that threat as well. I'm going to finish there. I just want to put a couple of final slides up to let people know what the IES is doing here. This is the first one with regards to decoding the EU. So it's much the same as this. It's the webinar series. So you bring your computer and your brown bag for lunch. 4 separate webinars, each of them exploring the 3 EU institutions and decision making. So here's the dates: Commission, Council, Parliament, interinstitutional decision making. If you feel you need more information, great crash course for the exam. You can certainly register, and I think this would be a fantastic exercise. For those of you connected still to teaching and training, we're running an additional series of Jean Monnet activities throughout 2012 called Bridging the Gap. And the design here is to improve the quality of education in secondary schools, but also at universities as well. We have workshops designed for the enhancement of learning for secondary teachers, but also a variety of webinars and the under construction online module and a handbook as well. I'm looking to see right now if there's been any written comments, but I don't see any at this point. We have only a minute or 2 left, so I think what I'll do is call it a halt there. Thank everybody for attending. I'm really pleased that we've had these 4 Jean Monnet webinar series. They're all going to be available permanently online, so you can download them at your leisure and your pleasure. And thank you all for joining. Take care.